Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the Center for Justice and Law's Spotlight series, where we talk about topics on health, justice, and law with guests. My name is Raina Meyer. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a student coordinator for the CJL at Hamline University. This is our, I believe, fifth Spotlight conversation around the topic of immigrant and refugee health. And our conversation today will be with Juwaria Jama. Juwaria, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me here. Hello, everyone. My name is Juwaria Jama. I'm a senior in high school and current PSEO student.
I'm so glad that we get to have you here today. I asked Juwaria to join me because we've known each other for almost 4 years now, I think, through thick and thin. We've been through everything, close friends, and we've organized together and kind of parallel to each other. And she inspires me so much because, we've been able to work together, and I've also been able to see JJ work from afar in other spaces, and you just never give up. You always fight for what's right, and you do so with such a bright, fiery passion in your heart. And I think it's something that all of us could learn something about, how you just persist no matter what, even when things get hard. And you're amazing. And I think we need more people like you in the world. So that's why you inspire me. And kind of connecting with that, talking a bit about how much work you do in your community. Can you specify what type of work you do?
Yeah, for sure. Again, thank you so much. So I do a lot of organizing around climate justice in my community. I joined the Minnesota Youth Council when I was a freshman, and I'm currently serving my 4th year as Congressional District 4 representative for the council. And a lot of the work that we do on the Minnesota Youth Council is representing young people who are the same age as us across the state. So we do a lot of work around legislation, things like that, making sure that our communities are accurately represented. And I mentioned some of my climate justice work. So I'm the state lead for the Minnesota Youth for Climate Justice. We're a youth-led climate justice organization that started up in 2019. And we do a lot of work around climate justice, climate advocacy, bringing education inside schools and organizing young people to do work around the climate inequities. And I think something that's so important about the conversation we're about to have and the work that I do is a lot of the issues that we're trying to make change around mostly impact communities of color, mostly impact immigrant communities, mostly impact communities whose voices are not taken into account. And so as a Somali person, as a young person, I think that, it's so important that we bring people whose experiences are at the forefront of these issues into the conversation and organize with them, not for them.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And the work that you have done to make sure that that happens is incredible. So, you mentioned that you worked in legislative spaces as a young person and in climate justice. So how do you see the topic of immigrant and refugee health, specifically tying into climate justice and legislative advocacy?
Yeah, so one thing that our organization, Minnesota Youth for Climate Justice, one thing that we've thought a lot about regarding climate has been climate migration. So a lot of the time when we talk about climate change, people are really quick to be like, well, climate change isn't going to really affect us for another decade or 2 decades and things like that, which is not true at all. A lot of the communities that are impacted are low-income communities that are filled with people of color. And especially in Minnesota, you think about places like North Minneapolis, where there are incinerators and these communities of colors are impacted. But more so on the topic of immigrants and refugees, a lot of, there are going to be climate migrants. There already are climate migrants who are moving from their countries because of how intense the climate has been changing and how they need a home here. And if we aren't addressing the fact that climate change is having a real effect on these on people overseas and how that's going to impact us here, then we're not doing justice by them. And another thing, I mentioned that I'm Somali, and when I started learning a lot more about climate and how climate change affects us, I remember learning from my family that our country, Somalia, dealt with a lot of droughts. And that was one of the reasons that people were displaced and had to move here because there were droughts and there were floods and there was, just so many issues that were happening regarding the climate that was forcefully displacing people. So, acknowledging these things are so important, but making sure that we actually have resources to help people, that the communities that these that immigrants and refugees are moving into are not communities that are going to be filled with air pollution or filled with, more of the issues that they're dealing with.
Absolutely. Yeah, I feel like that's something that kind of gets lost in the conversation is like, and this is something that we've talked about, like rallying and like calling to action and like speaking about issues. But then it's kind of hard, like, especially as a youth organizer, to know exactly what to do next and like to mobilize people to certain action items on that. So what are like some barriers that you faced like as a youth organizer in trying to work within these systems that are insanely stressful and like kind of built in some ways to curb progress from happening?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that you and I have talked about a lot. Um, I think the thing is that we look at young people, we look at high school students, and our immediate thought is they don't know what they're talking about. They don't have, credentials to be talking about these issues. They don't have insight. They don't have lived experiences. But we do have lived experiences. And one of the things that I've dealt with, and a lot of people I organize have dealt with a lot, has been like regarding like working at the legislative level. And so I know that a lot of times when we would work around climate bills, these legislators would act so excited to have young people in their offices and would keep telling us that, they're going to do work with us. They're going to make these changes happen, but instead would throw us around into a circle because for them, it seemed like they were able to waste our time simply because of the fact that we were young. And one of the other things that I see is tokenizing young people. I think politicians' favorite thing to do is, hang around with the young person and be like, look at my young intern, look at this young person that I have working here, but they're not paying their interns and they're also just not listening to us at all. So it makes it really hard because I think it makes it really hard to identify who your actual supporters are in office when you deal with so many people who aren't genuine or aren't willing to actually help you.
Yeah, no, that is so real. The tokenization piece is like definitely definitely there at the legislature, and like so many of the internships are unpaid, and a lot of the time like young people especially like are putting a lot of like emotional labor into the work that they do, and it can take a big toll, and not just like a time sort of way. Like they're not just devoting their time, they're devoting their lived experiences too, and that should at the very least like be compensated. So I think you brought up an excellent point there. um yeah, I guess like kind of a follow-up question to that is, how do you like keep like finding the motivation to work in like these areas that are like really hard to navigate at times? Like how do you keep going?
Well, definitely people like you. I think that I'm surrounded with so many other young people that I'm organizing with. And the fact that we're able to build community is so important. Like when you're working around an issue and you're the only person that's spending countless hours fighting against it, like you're going to get burned out so easily. You're going to get drained so easily. But when you have a community of people who are fighting for the same thing, it makes it a lot more bearable. And one thing to me that made me that gave me a lot of hope in the climate movement was when we were holding climate strikes, it was global. There were people from not just across the United States, but across the world holding these climate strikes. Young people who are my age, who are older than me, younger than me, spoke different languages, and we're all fighting for the same thing. And it was one of those things where I was like, okay, all of these people care about the same thing. Even if the legislators, even if my parents, even if the school teachers like don't see what I'm doing, at least I know that there are other people that care and are fighting towards the same thing. So building community is so important. Finding your people is so important.
Yeah, no, that's so true. And just so our audience knows, like JJ was one of the main organizers of the climate strike in Minnesota. And back in September of 2019, like before COVID and everything, the climate strike like outside the Capitol literally had more than 10,000 people.
Which was insane.
Absolutely insane. And I think that like that combined with all of the other incredible stuff that you guys have done has really helped talk about like the intersectional issues that go into climate change, because like I feel like up until then, especially Minnesota, it had been more of like you know, a lot of older, more affluent people really cared about like issues in the boundary waters, but and as they should have, but like I feel like people like you really helped open that conversation about, okay, like how does that affect other communities who aren't even aware of it?
Mhm.
So like how do you see like the issues of health and like climate change like intersecting?
Yeah. And I think it really goes back to the earlier point that I was making about like air pollution and displacement and things like that. So freshman year of high school, when I was starting to learn more about climate inequities and the environment, things like that, I remember being asked what my climate story was. And I had no idea. I was like, what do you mean climate story? Like, I'm doing fine. And, you know, I had a person who does storytelling really like help me find my story. And I'm from North Minneapolis. I grew up on the north side. And I remember just every day waking up and seeing, you know, air pollution through my window because we lived right across the street from a couple of factories. There were two intersecting highways that were right next to us. And so it was just constantly seeing air pollution around us every single day. And it was one of those things that I, you know, viewed as normal. But I went to a suburban school, so I would drive 20 minutes away. And then I would see the differences that the urbanization just didn't exist there. There were no factories. Everybody there was just breathing in normal air and breathing in normal water. I mean, drinking normal water. So I think that dissonance just made me realize that like the health of my community was just so much more different than the health of the people I went to school with. And once I started learning more about air pollution, I remember reading a study that said around 1,000+ people die in the Twin Cities to air pollution effects every single year, which is insane to think about. And especially, and you know, you think about the people who are in these communities, it's mostly BIPOC people. You think about the Herc incinerator that is in North Minneapolis and how they refer to the incinerator as renewable energy, even though it's just continuing to put toxic pollutants back into the air. And you know, the people that live in these communities are at a disadvantage because it's extremely hard to fight back against it. Like Herc, like one thing about Herc is that it's past its expiration date. So incinerators are only supposed to exist for I think around like 30 years or something. And so Herc has already passed its expiration date, but it still exists. And it still exists because there's so much money that's funneling into the people who are supporting this that it's so hard to, you know, stop the incinerator from existing in these communities. So yeah, I just see the effects of health on BIPOC communities from air pollution, and you know, the water is another really important thing. Like we think about line 3 and the indigenous communities up north that are being affected by this pipeline. And you know, their indigenous communities care so much about their wild rights, but it's also the Mississippi River, the water that is sacred to them and that is, you know, extremely important to us. And you know, now that this pipeline is built and is active, we know that if there's an oil spill, the water is going to drive all up the Mississippi to us, to the water that we're drinking, and it's just going to continue to affect our health. And again, I think like all of these health issues tie back to money and tie back to the communities that it's affecting, because they would never, you know, governments would just never dare to put a pipeline in a community that's majority white. They wouldn't put incinerators in Maple Grove in a suburban, you know, neighborhood, because it would just, you know, that wouldn't be to their benefit. So yeah, a lot of these issues really truly intersect, and health is one of those things that okay, going off onto another tangent actually. The other thing about environmental inequities and thinking about climate justice is a lot of times people talk about like saving the boundary waters. People talk about, all of these like endangered species, and they talk about the trees and how trees need to be replanted somewhere else. And we can all agree that like these have effects on the environment and it's so important. But a lot of times the human aspect is taken away. We don't really think about the humans who are being impacted because of the water, the humans that are being impacted because of the way the plants are changing, or the lack of food or the droughts and things like that. And because there is such a lack of humanizing environmental inequities and climate injustice, we don't really get to think about the health of these communities and prioritizing that health, especially when it comes to like legislation.
Oh my gosh. So true. All of that. Oh my God. Like, yeah, I so agree with everything, especially like the part that you said about like they wouldn't even think about putting like an incinerator or other like another thing that's detrimental to the environment in like a more affluent community.
Right.
Like part of that is just like the outrage that would be present, and the fact that like people in those communities are probably more likely to feel like they'd be taken seriously by their elected officials, and they would know like how to navigate those systems better. Just oh my gosh, so much ties into it, like education and salaries and all of that.
Right.
And I know that you've spoken a lot about the connection between climate justice and health, because like that's what you've been working within for so many years. Are there any like other personal connections that you have to the topic of like immigrant and refugee health justice and law?
That is a really good question. Yeah, I guess just for me, my immediate thoughts are just about like um climate justice and things like that. But I do think like education and health justice for immigrant communities is just another thing that's like missing from the picture. Um, but yeah, don't yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, everything intersects, and like
It really does.
yeah, we've talked a lot about like just in our casual conversations about like class and how that like ties into literally everything.
Yeah.
So, and like education, like you just said too.
Yeah. Yeah, like I don't have too much knowledge about just like health justice and like in immigrant and refugee communities, just outside of like what I know about climate. But like I mean, speaking from like familial experiences with it, like my family came from Somalia like 20 years ago, came as refugees and like built their lives here, and I think like just watching your family like navigate like being immigrants and like being American, and navigating health is just really interesting. Like one of those things that people don't think about is like the language barriers that that happens with like within the medical field, because something I even think about is like even in Somali, like if I'm translating regularly right now, like if I would have to translate medical terms, it would be so different than like our regular everyday like day-to-day like language. And you also think about like accessibility, like getting like I know that having health insurance is like one of the hardest things ever, just because the amount of money that goes into it, and just like there's such a lack of like accessibility and resources to help people get health insurance. So I think that there's just a lot of hoops that people have to jump through. And moving here, America doesn't make it easy for you to like know how to navigate those things.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really great point. And we've talked in previous spotlights, like we've talked with like guests who also like come from immigrant and refugee families, and they talk about the same things, like the translation barriers, which can be so like it can be life-threatening in some circumstances. So that's a really important point. And I mean, we've talked about like so many like important issues so far, and you've brought up such incredible points about like things that we should acknowledge and work on. Are there any organizations or resources that you'd like to share with people watching that you'd like us to boost?
Yeah, I think health is such a broad topic. So like for me, like in the Somali community, I know a group that comes to mind right away is like Alliance Wellness Center. And they do a lot of work around mental health and addiction, and offering just like treatment and like counseling and things like that, which I think is really important, because when you come from like an immigrant family, I think that there is a lack of understanding when it comes to mental health and when it comes to addiction and when it comes to like actually navigating those things together. So they're a really great resource. And then there is another group called Woven. Um, and I know that yeah, there's another group called Woven, and there's another group that they're called Rahma Shelter, that's just starting up, and they're starting up a domestic like violence like shelter for women and children. So that's another great resource. I can also get the links to you if you guys want to share it out.
Yeah, that would be amazing. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing those things. Like, I think it's really, really important for people to be able to know about them, because even if they don't need them now, to be able to look back and
Right.
have them later. So thank you so much for sharing those, and obviously for everything you said so far. And just to kind of close us out, if you could leave like this conversation and the audience watching with one anecdote or message about anything you've talked about so far or anything new, what would you want to leave us with?
Yeah, I would just want to say that everything interconnects. When you're thinking about any issues, whether it's race or climate or capitalism, all of it just intersects and affects us in really unique ways. So I would say check your privilege, check what you've learned before, unlearn them, and connect the dots.
Such good advice. I think everyone should hear more of that. JJ, you are so, so incredible. And just the insight that you've shared in this a half hour has been so valuable. And I just feel so lucky and honored to be able to know you and to be able to talk about such important issues with you today. And thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thank you guys for having me. This was really great.
Yeah. Well, if those watching want to stay in touch with the CJL, you can feel free to follow us on Instagram and Facebook. It's just HUCJL. And our next spotlight will be Wednesday, October 22nd. Same time, 4 o'clock, live streaming on Facebook. Thank you all so much for tuning in. And thank you again, JJ, for being the best guest